Hi, I'm Stephanie Rozzo. Welcome to Nature Sketch Crates Go Out and Sketch a Japanese Camellia instructional video. In this video, I'll be showing you how to sketch a Japanese Camellia, applying what you learned in your step-by-step lesson. First, make sure you have all the materials you need before you go out to sketch. Today, I'm sketching a Japanese Camellia bloom that I trimmed from my neighbor's bush. Apply what you know about Japanese camellias from your step-by-step sketching lesson. Remember, this is just a sketch. Take your time, observe and paint. Don't let yourself get too caught up with accuracy, just relax and have fun. Apply what you already know about camellias from your step-by-step lesson. The first thing you want to do is look at it and start to see how it could fit on your page. Now you could take it and simply outline it, which is what I'll probably do to make it super easy. So go ahead and just kind of trace around the outside. Now, this will be a little bit bigger than the actual plant. You don't have to include all of it. So I'm not going to include this leaf underneath. So now it's outlined on my page here, and this area that I didn't have a chance to fill anything in, I'll just go ahead and use this mark as the end of this leaf here, and I'll take that in here, and there's the bud, and then the flower itself is kind of a circular shape. So I've used really light, rough marks to get the basic shape of this plant on my paper. I'm going to work from the center out, and I'm going to go ahead and draw another circular shape for the stamen with the anthers and filaments, and it's just a rough shape giving me the basic idea of where it is on this flower. And then I'm going to start drawing in each petal, just kind of really rough, starting from the center. And if they're too big or too small, don't worry too much, just draw them in. If you don't get enough, that's fine too. What's more important is to try to get the pattern, the overlapping pattern, right. So I'm just drawing each one of these in real quick, starting from the center and just kind of moving out. And as you can see, the sizing on that isn't quite right, and that's okay. Just adjusted it a little bit, but you can just leave it the way it is too. These aren't going to be exact. It's just a sketch. Also, as you move the flower, once you had it on your paper and you move it to the side, it's going to be in a slightly different perspective, and the sizing of those petals might be just a little bit different now than when you were tracing it. Just getting the basic shape on here, so don't worry too much about getting it right. There's a lot of roughly petals in here, so I'm just going to kind of draw them in, kind of overlapping. Again, just keeping with that, working from the inside out. If you have too many petals or not enough, or you lost track of where they're at, it's okay. It's still gonna look like a flower. It's still gonna look like a camellia. This one ruffles in like this towards these stamen. And I'm just gonna start drawing them in as little lines. I'm just starting from one side and here on the bottom, because the way I see them from the top, most of them look like little round tops from the anther. I might start drawing in those anthers just real rough, kind of an oval shape at the tip. And then I can draw in parts of the filament. Once I have that first layer that I can see, then I can start adding in some more of the anthers. Just kind of mimicking the way they are on the flower in front of me. And this is not exact at all. Again, this is just a sketch, so I'm just kind of putting them in real rough and fast. I don't want to spend too much time on this, just a quick study, just to relax and enjoy some time outside, or to study this plant a little bit, to get to know it a little bit better. Maybe you're making a gift for someone, or just having fun painting and practicing. It's also a great way to study something before you create a more detailed painting, if you're going to do that as well. Just getting those roughly in there. And I'm going to go ahead and bring these petal lines down, or maybe even add some more in that space. Again, not being exact at all, just getting an idea of this plant. Then I can start adding, each of these petals have a little bit of a indentation here in the middle, like 2 half circles here at the end. So kind of just add that on a few of them with a slightly darker mark from your pencil to indicate that's your final mark. I guess I should say it's your final pencil mark, because when we add ink later, you can change that. And now that I have those details in, I'm going to go ahead and start on the leaves. Again, remember that the outline of the leaves is probably going to be bigger. There's very tiny serrated edges. I'm going to go ahead and add those right now too. And again, we're working for speed, so anytime I can skip something, I will. And this leaf looks a little bit different from this perspective, that's okay. And I can see some of the serrated edges on that leaf, but not a lot. Might just add a few of those in there, even though I forgot. Very tiny on this one. And I can see some of those veins as well on the leaves. So I'm adding those in. And there's a little bud back here that I had included, so I'm going to just move my head around to see that. Can't really move the camera, but I'm going to go ahead and just add that in real quick. And there's another bud here at the top. And we'll add those details as well. Sometimes you'll find camellias with just one bloom, and that's usually because it has been trimmed. The buds have been trimmed that grew around it. And from what I read, it said that that actually makes the camellia bloom bigger if you do that. Again, saving some time by using my lines that I've already drawn and drawing over them, creating some serrated edges. Doesn't need to be exact. This is just a sketch, so you're just adding those in based on the size of the edges. Again, even my mid vein here is not exact. The number of veins I'm putting in, not exact. Just getting an idea. We're just getting a quick idea of this plant. The shape, size, its color. This last leaf here, little mid vein, and one more, which now I'm looking at it from this perspective is a little bit different, so I'm going to change that a little bit. Again, not paying attention to how many serrations there are, where exactly they're located, just adding them in at an approximate size of those serrations. So they're pretty small, so I'm just kind of drawing in small jagged edges here, just where I see them. And the mid vein is pretty prominent there. And I see this one vein coming out here, and I see another one there and there, and the other ones are not as apparent, so I'm not going to draw them in. And it seems like some of these veins that are apparent are meeting next to each other like this, but from what I can see, and then some of them are off like that. So just added in what I see and what I'm observing, really approximate. And I think this was just a few too many, the stamen there, and I'm going to adjust that shape a little bit. Maybe a few more on this side. And that's okay to go back and erase a little bit. Just don't get too carried away with it. Just a quick sketch. And I'm going to go ahead and write its name on the bottom here. I don't know what kind of Japanese Camellia, but I know it is a Japanese Camellia, and I'm going to write in the scientific name as well, and I don't know the variety. And there I have my rough, quick drawing, and next I'll add some paint. I went ahead and revived the paint I saved from my step-by-step Camellia lesson to use for this applied sketching lesson. And I also have my paints here just in case I need to add some more or make something that's a little bit more concentrated. And I've already revived them with a little bit of water. And I'm just going to start the same way I did with the step-by-step lesson and take some of this very light pink color that I had mixed before, and I'm going to add it to all these petals. So I'm just going to go ahead, and I didn't test it out beforehand, it's pretty dark, but this is a darker Camellia anyway. And I think that the petals actually go here over that. So I'm gonna just make that adjustment right now with the paint. You may want to test the color out on some test paper before applying it directly to your painting like I did. And make sure to work on one side to the other so that your paint looks a little more continuous. Picking up the paint whenever you need it, and if you have too much water or too much paint, make sure you dab it onto your towel before applying it to your paper. Sometimes it's a good idea just to dab it on your towel just to make sure you don't have too much of either one of those. And I'm just going from one side to the other, going back and forth to this edge because I don't want it to dry out too much. And it's okay if some of those edges dry because this is just a very rough style of painting. Alternatively, you could just paint each one of these petals individually to reduce the number of lines you might have. I'm just trying to get this done quickly because it is a sketch, so I'm not worried too much about those lines, but you could do it just like that, just fill in each one individually. Feel free to go back and add a little bit more paint wherever you think is needed. Right here in this area here. And then you can clean off your brush. And you can add some of the yellow. You may want to wait for the pink to dry first. I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with the yellow and take some of this really light wet, so it's not very concentrated. A lot of water's been added to it. I'll test it on my test paper. Looks pretty good to me. And these anthers are pretty bright yellow. So I'm going to go ahead and just put them in, and I'm not being exact at all. I am just roughly putting them in here, just dabbing it. And the filaments are pretty white, but they do get a little darker at the bottom, so maybe creating a new color to add that shadow. But for now, I'm going to leave it just like that. I'm going to clean off my brush. And I realized I forgot that there's a little bit of pink on the tip there, so I'm just going to add that real quick. Tip of that bud. Clean off my brush again. And then I'm going to go ahead and add the green color. So I'm adding a very wet, light, bright green as the base layer of these leaves. And again, you can test it on your paper, on your test paper beforehand. I'm just filling in the outside of that space and then just filling right in the inside. And you could take it from the bottom part and then the top part, or whatever works for you. This is just a sketch, so however you fill that in, it's fine. Leaving some lines and marks from the watercolor, completely fine. And I'm going to go ahead and add this leaf in. I usually start top to bottom, left to right, so I don't create any smudges. And I like outlining large areas first and then filling them in. Try not to let that edge dry too long, but again, it's just a sketch, so I'm not too worried about those things. I'll just fill that in a few times, move that watercolor around a little bit. And the bud is a little bit lighter than everything else. I'm going to pick up some paint, dab it off on my towel quite a bit, and then go ahead and add it. And you can see that produced a lighter color. Again, I'm going to do the other bud, so I'm going to do the same thing. Very light, faint color. so not as much pigment added. So you can take it as the top and then add paint to the bottom instead of just doing it as one big section. And doing this leaf, I'm just going to do it as one big section because it's not actually all that big. You can see the color is varying a bit because I'm being very fast, not worrying too much about getting anything exact here. We're just getting an idea of this plant. Clean off my brush. And now I'm going to paint in a darker pink over this lighter pink. So I'm going to take a bit more concentrated color so it has a little bit more paint pigment to it, a little less water. Dab it on my towel and I'm going to check it on my test strip. And I think that's great for this. So it's not the same, but it's close enough. And it will work for today. So I'm going to go ahead and just go through and add some of this to add a little more depth and color. And it tends to be a little darker on the inside edges of these petals, so I'm going to take it one by one, paint a little bit of that paint in there, cleaned off my brush, and then pull the paint just to the edge by painting over it with that clean wet brush. And then pulling my paintbrush to the edge. And so I'll do that again here. I'm going to paint in where the darkest areas are, where I can see. Clean my brush off. And then take that clean wet brush over those edges towards the lighter edge. So the paint, the darker paint, and towards the lighter edge. It creates a little bit of a gradient there. And if it didn't create enough, it's not dark enough, just add a little bit more. And continue to do that for all of those petals. I'm running low on the paint in my palette, so I will have to mix some more. 4H Deep Red Rose. And just add a couple drops of that to the palette. And add a little bit of water to it. Very, very concentrated, so pull some more to the side, adding more water. I'm going to test it on my paper to make sure it's the same. See, it's a lot darker. So just going to keep pulling a little bit to the side, adding more water so I can lighten it up a bit. Dab it on my towel and test it, and that looks a lot closer. So I'm going to go ahead and use that color. These outside petals are pretty faint, so I'm going to leave those a little bit. Again, just painting a little bit in on each petal and then taking that clean wet brush over it to kind of create a gradient towards the edges. I'm adding a little bit more water because some of that concentrated color moved into that area of my palette. Double check it on my test paper, it looks good. And continuing on. And some of these petals I can't tell exactly what's going on with them, and maybe I added a few extra here. And you can see I went out of the lines. It's not a big deal. You'll get a chance to recreate things. I'll add some lines here. Move it towards the edge. Don't get too worried or caught up with the details there. I want it to be a bit darker. While this is wet, I'm going to go ahead and add in a little bit more. And you can see it kind of spreads out a little bit, which is totally fine. I kind of like that there. And take the clean brush and smooth that out a little bit too. And I can always add more there, but I like having that kind of line in that space. So it all depends on what you're looking for. So again, I'm adding this to the darker areas. Cleaning off my brush by adding some water, so I have a clean wet brush, and moving some of that paint into the lighter areas. And since this is just a sketch, just a real rough idea of this flower, it doesn't need to be exact. We add a little bit more dark area in there. So I just want to go throughout and keep adding some paint to the darker areas that you observe on your flowers. So they are really dark there. I'll add a bunch of water with a clean wet brush and pull it to the edges, and it's still way too dark, so I'm going to dab it off again and then continue to move that to the edges. I'm going to create a new space on my palette for this lighter color because it keeps getting too dark. Test it out again, looks good. Since this is a sketch, it's not a big deal, but I'd rather not have it quite that dark. Dabbing it again off on my towel, going over the edges of the dark color you just added and bringing it to those lighter edges of the petals. And so I just want to keep doing this for all the petals to give them that little bit of gradient and depth. And if there's any spots that you want to add more to, if you add it while it's wet, it's going to bleed a little bit. But you can also add it again when it's dry. You don't want to work on it too much, you don't want to add too much, but adding a little bit more contrast in some areas might really make this pop. So you can do that now, or you can do all the petals and then come back and do it later. So just go ahead and go throughout and add color to all these petals. I like the way that pink looks, so I'm going to go ahead and start adding a little bit more of the dark green color. So I have this deeper green. I'm going to go ahead and use it to start adding. Be careful not to touch the wet parts on my flower. I'm going to start adding that in to my leaves. And I'm going to add these in kind of over a majority of the space. I'm going to leave a little bit that really light green, bright green color. But for the most part, I'm just going to add that over the entire space of these leaves, because they are mostly this deep color. They have a little bit of that bright green underneath, a little bit shiny. And I'm going to be careful about the direction as well, paying attention to the basic direction of how the veins are in those leaves. And Maybe bringing more paint in, another layer of this color to darken it up too. It's best to work when it's not wet. Just a little bit of wet there. It's okay. But I am starting in these darker areas on my leaf. It's darker, so I'm starting at the bottom and working up to the edge where it's a little bit lighter. The paint in my brush will gradually get less and less and lighter and lighter. And I'll do the same thing here. And I'm not worried about this. I'm just going to basically turn that petal into a leaf there because it got a little bit of green on it. Not being too concerned, trying to work in that direction, but not being too worried about anything being exact. And again, the darker areas right here, and then I'm going to work out to the lighter areas because the paint in my brush will just start to lighten, as you can see there, because it's running out of paint pigment. So I'll add a nice natural gradient, which works well for this space. And even add just a little bit more, doing the same thing, starting in those darker areas. And it doesn't lighten a lot, just a little bit. So this works out, the technique works out really well for that. If you have a brush that's starting to get a little bit wonky, you can pick up the paint and then just kind of roll it on your towel to get a little bit nicer tip. I'm kind of reserving these edges because they're lighter along the edges. And from my perspective, this leaf, which you probably can't see, is a lot lighter on the edges. So I'm going to treat it kind of like I did those petals. I added some paint, and then I'm going to add a little bit of a clean brush to the edge to pull it down a little bit. It has a slight natural gradient. Maybe add a little bit more of the dark paint in there. And these are just a little bit lighter, so I'm going to pick up a little bit of other green, that brighter green, dab it off on my towel and check it again. It is super bright. Maybe just a little bit. There you go. And then check it again. Looks good to me there. I'm going to add a little bit in here. I'll probably add a little more of that deeper green as well, but I think I'm just going to add the bright green in there first. Just one more layer of that. And while I wait for these leaves to dry, because they're not, and you can test that by just dabbing it. Oh, that one feels pretty dry. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more yellow to these anthers, and I'm going to take a little bit of the yellow here. And it is just such a bright yellow to me from my view here. I'm going to take a little bit, and I'm going to add those in just real roughly to those anthers. As you can see, I'm not being real exact. I'm just kind of dabbing it to get it in real quick. I like that's a lot better, a lot brighter. And the filaments have a little bit of color to them, so they're not totally white. So what I'm going to do is, I think this color here, the red oxide color, has a little bit of that and a little bit of the yellow, so I'm going to mix them together. Still way too much red oxide. Pick up some more yellow and add it in. And I'm going to check that on my test paper. And that looks like the right color to me. And I'm going to add that to the areas just down here in the bottom to give this flower a little bit of depth. And then in this middle area seems a little dark. And that'll just give it, I'm going to put some lines through it too, just randomly. That'll just give it a little bit more of a depth than it had before. I may even just take a little bit of that color when that's dry and add it in here to give it even more depth and go a long way. And I'm going to go ahead and work on these leaves again. They're pretty dry, and just dab them here. Don't wipe your hand across it, it'll smudge it pretty strong. I'm going to pick up more of that deep green color. And I'm just going to go ahead and add a little bit more into these spaces. Just to bring it up one more level. Add one more level of contrast and depth. So it pops just a little bit more, it looks a little bit more realistic. And by leaving some of these areas lighter, kind of mimics the shininess a little bit. And again, I'm not being real exact about this application, I'm just adding it in. Because this is just a sketch, we're just doing getting a quick idea of this plant. And just a couple of colors rather than many colors working it for a long time. We're just going to get a quick idea. Beautiful little sketch. In which all the imperfect mistakes make it even more perfect. If you do something that you don't like, it probably is going to just add more character and interesting, make your painting a little bit more interesting. So again, I'm just using that same color, just really light on these buds because the buds are much lighter, and I'm kind of drawing it in on the edge, just like a line like I'm drawing rather than going over the whole space painting it in. So the last thing I'm going to do is add a little bit of this deep color, this red oxide color, in at the base of these stamen, the bottom of the filaments, just to add a little bit more depth. And this just brings it up just a little bit more. And if you add that throughout just randomly in a few places, it looks a little bit more natural too, because the light's not going to hit everywhere, and the dark spaces aren't going to be everywhere, just kind of randomly in there. So that makes that flower a little deeper. I'm actually going to add a little bit here too. And there. And then there's a little bit of this rust color on the buds, just on the edges here. And even those are a little wet, I'm just going to add it in because this is just a sketch, I'm just getting it down quickly. So I like how this paint is, and you can continue to add more paint. Just ask you not to work on it too long because this is just a sketch. Just want to finish it quickly and then a few layers of paint. I'm going to start with the 005 black micron. It's a very thin line. And I'm going to just kind of redraw all the lines I made before. And I start with this thin one because I can start redefining them, and if I make a mistake I don't like, I can change it easily with a thicker micron. So go ahead and go through and redefine the lines. So if you don't like, maybe like here you painted, like I did, you painted on this side and not on that side, make that the new line for that leaf. It doesn't have to be exactly what you drew the first time. Kind of base it on where the paint ended up. So I'm going to redefine that area there based on where my paint is. So go ahead and go through, redraw the lines you made, and create new ones based on where your paint landed. You may also want to use a sheet of paper to protect your painting from your hand, from any smudges, any oil that's on your hand, or from anything else that might be there. And when you're redrawing your lines, those don't have to be exact. You don't draw the line the same as it was before, that's okay. This is just a sketch. All mistakes are welcome. So I have the 01 black micron, and I don't need to add a lot of this line. It's kind of a medium thickness. So I might just add it to the scientific name. Most of the lines in this are going to be a little bit thicker because this is a sturdy petaled and leaved flower. Everything is pretty sturdy and thick, and the thicker line will mimic that a little bit better. I may come back and add a little bit more of the 01 black micron. So I'm going to move on to the 08 black micron, and I'm going to go ahead and add a lot of this in. It's kind of redrawing those lines in these darker areas and just a lot of spaces in general. I don't want to outline everything because then it'll just look flat. I just want to kind of go over these darker spaces. And that's where I might add a little bit more with the 01 black micron later. But having that real contrast of the very light and the very dark, thicker line gives it some real depth. So you want to go throughout and just add this, not everywhere, but any of these darker, deeper areas. So kind of closer to the center, the inner parts, the darker areas, where there's a lot of shadow meeting the edge. Those are good spots to add this in. But just try not to do it everywhere so that you add a little bit of depth with those lines. And the same thing with the filaments here. You can kind of add them down here at the bottom, but kind of leave it sparing for the top. And it just adds this nice depth instead of a flat image. It makes it pop a little bit, even though we didn't use a lot of paint. And just add it, not everywhere, but most areas. Just because this is a hard flower, and you see that I'm not even really paying attention to where I'm adding these lines. Just kind of adding it in. It doesn't have to be exact. You can be more exact if you want to. But it's just a sketch. Still looks like it has serrated edges. So these areas, the lines along these areas where this is darker paint, the shadowed areas are where I'm drawing these lines in. So that adds some depth, making the flower look like it is a little bit more three-dimensional. Without adding lots and lots of paint. I'm going to use this pen to draw over the common name just to make it stand out a little bit more. And at this point I could go back and add some more of the 01 black micron or more paint. Just make sure that if you do add more, that you let the ink dry before adding more paint and the paint dry before adding more ink. Finally, you'll want to add any observations if you haven't already in the white spaces. You can just leave it blank as is. You can also just add the scientific and common name. It's up to you. This is your sketch. Make sure to make it yours. We're done. Great job observing your world, and keep practicing. If you like this video, go ahead and click that like button, subscribe to this channel, and check out naturesketchcrate.com for future crates.